Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Israel in the Middle East in our continuing study of world civilizations. Our story really goes back to World War I and the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. You'll remember that the Ottomans at one point had controlled everything uh, from what we call Turkey today, throughout Eastern Europe and across North Africa, all the way to the Straits of Gibraltar. But they had been losing that over many hundreds of years. And the death knell sounded in World War I. In fact, one of the figures in that defeat was the infamous Lawrence of Arabia, a British officer who was the liaison between the British forces and a group of Arabian tribes, hence the nickname that he received. And fascinating movie. If you want to see a good movie, look at that movie Lawrence of Arabia with Richard. Is it Richard O'Toole? I might be messing up his name. Delightful movie. Actually, one of my favorites. Anyway, end of commercial. Um, in 1917, Lord Balfour of England put together a plan. It had been agreed upon, at least in principle, by both the French and also, I'm given to understand, the Americans as well. And it was a plan that showed sympathy with Zionist desires to allow the Jewish people to come to somewhere to the land of what was then called Palestine. There was no nation of Israel at this point, had not been for many hundreds, actually thousands of years by this time. Um, Allowed them to come back to that land in the Middle East, the land that had formerly been Canaan and then Israel, and now is known as Palestine, where they might find a homeland there. Of course, in World War II, we have the Holocaust, and this gave a added drive now to this movement of Jewish people to return to the land where they would not be exterminated, they would not be persecuted, a land of their own. And so the United Nations in 1947 came up with a partition plan. Notice the parts in orange, that's the Jewish state. But you have to remember when you look at that, for example, when you go to Beersheba and everywhere south, that's all desert. So a good portion of this land was just considered desert. Likewise, the land along the coast was nothing to, it was not considered all that great at the time. They've made it nice now. And likewise, notice that Jerusalem is part of this Arab state. And so you have this partition plan making up this area of what was called Palestine. In 1948, the state of Israel, encompassing largely what you see for the Jewish state here, is now going to be recognized. That recognition came both from Russia. Joseph Stalin had agreed to it, and the President of the United States, Harry Truman. Notice we actually have his letter here saying this government has been informed that a Jewish state has been proclaimed in Palestine, and recognition has been requested by and he adds the word provisional government thereof. The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority of the new, and initially they started to write the new Jewish state, but instead they called it the State of Israel. And that name now became part and parcel with the Jewish people that live there. Now, the Arab countries around there responded in some very quick attacks. And so you had a series of Arab-Israeli wars, both in the 1940s and 1950s. The greatest attack came in 1967 when Egypt and Jordan and Syria all announced their intentions, Egypt especially leading the way under President Nasser, said that he was going to destroy Israel. And the Israeli Air Force responded by doing this preemptive strike, which largely took out the enemy air power and gave Israel air superiority. The war only lasted 6 days. And by the end of that time, notice the green is Israel, but then the light green is the territory that they took both from Egypt in the west and the West Bank territory, and notice the northern section of the Golan Heights. So that these were the territories that were occupied by Israel, including Jerusalem. In fact, notice in our picture below, you see Israeli troops making it to the Temple Mount and advancing on the Dome of the Rock. That's the first landmark that you see whenever you get to Jerusalem. It's the most obvious landmark. In 1973, there was another war. Instead of 6 days, this one was more like 3 weeks. And it had an impact not just in Israel, but I remember the gas lines as gas ground to a halt. And it impacted really the whole world. But again, Israel was able to fight off its attackers. It's called the Yom Kippur War because what had happened is the enemies of Israel had waited until this most holy day, the day of Yom Kippur, when they assumed that the Israelites would be at their weakest as they were observing both the fast and observing this Day of Atonement. And they attacked, and it was effective at first. It was much more difficult to fight off than the 6-day war had been. But the Israelis, again, were ultimately successful. In 1991, we're getting even more recent history. Israel technically wasn't involved in the first Gulf War, but as the conflict with the UN troops versus Iraq moved into high gear, Iraq began shooting missiles into Tel Aviv. And this is just a night shot of some of those missiles coming across both Syria and Jordan, and now striking Tel Aviv. This picture is showing the wall, the security wall. I have to admit, it looks a little bit like a prison, dividing the Israelite territories from the West Bank territory. This is actually the road that takes you from Jerusalem into Bethlehem, and you're crossing through this wall. Notice on one side of the wall, the side that we're looking at, peace be with you, and you can see the Israeli Ministry of Tourism. The other side, on the other side of that same wall, you have some of the Palestinian graffiti and their attitudes toward all of this. It's you know, they feel very strongly about that. And so the conflict, even though perhaps not open warfare, but the conflict continues, and it takes regular fatalities, and there are bombings, and there are all sorts of terrible things going on a regular basis. In very recent times, President Donald Trump recognized, notice how the quote here, "Today we finally acknowledge the obvious that Jerusalem is Israel's capital. This is nothing more or less than a recognition of reality. It is also the right thing to do." And the United States publicly recognized Jerusalem as the capital. They had already moved their capital there many years back, but most countries had not recognized that act, and the United States actually did recognize that act.